In selecting men for office, let principle be your guide. Regard not the particular sect or denomination of the candidate, look to his character. Noah Webster. All right. Good morning and welcome to another morning episode of the Liberty Dad podcast, a discussion on politics and culture. You know, libertarians love arguing about things, just anything. You know, there's a popular meme that you'll see every now and then. It's like, just to prove that libertarians will argue about anything, here is a picture of a rock. Somebody will say, oh, no, 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 that's a stone, and, so on and so forth. So recently, we had an announcement from Justin Amash, who is a former congressman out of Michigan. And he said, hey, you know what? I'm going to be running for Senate up here in Michigan, and I'm going to do it as a Republican. And turns out that created yet another opportunity for us to debate various matters. So, what were we debating? The biggest thing is whether or not the Libertarian Party should run a candidate against a so-called Liberty Republican. Now, if you're not part of the libertarian circles and you're just kind of tuning in, you're like, Liberty, yeah, what are all these terms? Don't worry, we're going to define every one of them and we will keep them as simple as possible for you. Liberty Republican is basically somebody who is a libertarian or has enough they share enough values with libertarians that even though they are a candidate or a sitting member of, they're an elected member of some seat as a Republican, even though they're a Republican, we consider them a strong advocate of liberty. So we call them a Liberty Republican, right? Like, you kind of could be a libertarian. Maybe you are, right? Like, there are some who, like, it's kind of debatable. Like, are they really a libertarian, in the same sense that we regard ourselves? Or are do they just happen to be someone who's a conservative Republican that happens to have very strong values that align with ours? And so therefore, even though they're not a libertarian, they're still qualified as a Liberty Republican. So and it's always this debate, like, should we or should we not? And it's kind of interesting because I fall in the camp that says maybe we should. So there are basically three camps. The first camp is going to be the Libertarian Party should always run a candidate against everybody. Then there are the people that will say libertarians should run libertarians, but they should never run a libertarian against a Liberty Republican. And then there are people such as myself who are like, well, it depends. Maybe the answer isn't yes, the answer isn't no. So, how do we square this away? Well, I think the first thing that we can do is we can look at we can look at a definition here. I think when we're talking about these matters, it's very important to have our foundation very clear. And I don't think we have to get really deep into some philosophical argument. We don't have to try to, this is not complex. We can actually make it super simple. And I think hopefully by the end of this episode, I will have made it super simple and I'll have made my case that the answer is indeed maybe. And there is a guiding principle for which we do that. So let's first look at the term principle. Let's take a look at that and see what that gives us. So let's see, I'm gonna put this up on the screen. Surprisingly, if you just do a Google search on the word principle definition, just type those in, you will actually find that there's a pretty good, useful definition here. So it says a fundamental truth or a proposition that serves as the foundation for a system of belief or behavior or for a chain of reasoning. I like it, right? It's pretty simple. I mean, we could make it more simple. We could say, like, look, it's a fundamental truth that is the foundation for a belief or behavior, right? And I think that will work for this particular for what we're talking about today. So again, fundamental truth that serves as the foundation for a system of belief or behavior. So a good example for that is if you say, "Well, DL, what's the foundational principle of libertarianism?" Well, I would say it's self-ownership. You own yourself, and everything either submits or is in violation of that. Very simple. In this particular case, the principle that we want to that I say we should be using when it comes to determine who runs against who or when should be meritocracy, right? It should be, are you qualified? Are you the right person for the job, right? And when I am a big believer that people get themselves into roles that they don't belong being in, and they are not successful. Like, I'm not a musician. I can play some piano, I can play the trombone, like I can play Mary Had a Little Lamb, stuff like that, right? But beyond that, I'm not really nobody's looking to me to produce music because it's not my wheelhouse. It's not where I'm the best fit. Just because I can do it doesn't mean that I need to go and try to start my own band, right? Like quit my job and start my own band. Like, all right, I'm gonna be a starving artist until such time that I just make the big time and bam, I'm gonna be this great musician, right? It's just not there for me. It's not my right role. And so therefore, I keep it more as like the occasional hobby or just toying around, whatever, right? But it's not something that I put my primary effort into. There are other things, such as podcasting, that I think I do fairly well. So therefore, I do put a lot of effort into it because I believe this is the right role for me. The same concept applies when we're talking about candidates. We want to make sure that we get the right candidate in. Now, a lot of people, I think, there's a hypothetical that people love to put out. Now, to tell you about this hypothetical, let's take a look at why there's even a hypothetical when it comes to liberty Republicans. And that's because, am I on mute? No, okay. I'm sorry. I was looking at something else. I thought I was on mute. Apologies. I got a couple screens here and I was like, wait a minute, what? Different screen. It's okay. Okay. So at any rate, so there are four people that tend to come to mind when we're talking about liberty Republicans. Let me put them up on the screen so that you can see them. So there we have it. We got Ron Paul, Thomas Massey, Rand Paul, and then we've got Justin Amash. That generally covers the four most frequent names when people are talking about liberty Republicans. Okay. And these people tend to fall into some sort of hypothetical. And the hypothetical goes like this. Well, if Ron Paul were running as a candidate for president, would you run a libertarian against him? Right. And the reason is because when you look at Ron Paul's record, he has a pretty darn solid record. I think there might be like one or two votes for which people like say, "Oh yeah, well he voted, for this and he shouldn't have." But there's like literally, excuse me, there's like literally one or two votes, something like that, that weren't so good votes. But pretty much for the rest of them, people, look back and they're like, "Yep, I appreciate the fact that he voted either no, which was the case often, or yes." Similar for Thomas Massey. Rand Paul, is kind of iffy. Like there's a few more votes that people find questionable, and I think Justin Amash has a pretty good track record himself, right? So when people think of liberty Republicans, they tend to think of one of these four people generally, and then they do this thing. They say, "Well, if Ron Paul were running, would you run a candidate against him?" And it turns out, if you flip that hypothetical around, people don't want to play the hypothetical game anymore, right? And so, like, I pitted the other day, I said, okay, well, if Ron Paul were running against Justin Amash, would you vote for Ron Paul or would you vote for Justin Amash? And all of a sudden, people had all these objections, right? They were like, well, that doesn't even make sense. Like, he would never do that. And I'm like, well, I mean, I'm sure he would never do a lot of things since he's like 88 years old. He's probably not going to be running for any office at this point. That's how a hypothetical works. It's literally a thought experiment. It's it's kind of trying to illustrate a point. And the point that I was trying to illustrate by pitting one Liberty Republican against another is to illustrate that a Liberty Republican is not the end all be all as the first hypothetical kind of presents. Because a lot of people say, well, if DL were running, should DL run as, the libertarian president against Ron Paul? Now, the answer I would argue is no, right? But not for the same reason, for a different reason. But a lot of people kind of do that because they've elevated Ron Paul to a particular status and then use that as a means to identify what should and should not do. It's almost like the political version of like what would Jesus do, right? Like the political version of. So I'm not being blasphemous here, folks. And I think it's wrongheaded because I think it doesn't give us any idea how do we run or when do we run candidates whose opponent is not a Liberty Republican, right? Like this whole Liberty Republican thing seems to be, in my mind, an anomaly because as you can see, I've put up 4 pictures of people. 4. 4 people. Now, I want you to think about this for a moment. Right now, like we have a total of 535 Congress members, right? 100 senators, 435 House of Representatives, 535 people. And I found figure here. So this way, there. So I've trying to get my finger in the right direction. I can't do it. But anyway, I found 4 that are generally presented. 4 people out of 535 get to be considered Liberty Republicans. And the reason that they're considered Liberty Republicans is because of their record, right? Like people weren't calling any one of these men a Liberty Republican their first time running for office. Now people might look back and say, man, they really inspired me with some of their speeches and stuff like that. But you weren't really like, yeah, the hypothetical would not have worked because they didn't have a record for which the hypothetical could stand on. Right? The reason that the hypothetical seems to work when they say, would you run somebody against Ron Paul is because we have a very clear idea of how he would vote. So if somebody would say, well, how would Ron Paul vote for this? We can pretty much guess with a significant level of accuracy. Right. The same goes for most of these men, depending, there might be some votes where it's a little bit less clear for some of the other 3, and just depending on the topic and depending on what's being voted on, right? There are some things where it seems like it's a good idea, and Thomas Massey stands kind of by himself, and Justin Amash has done the same thing, and then Rand Paul, as I mentioned earlier, is kind of a little iffy on some of the votes there, but it's relatively clear. Like we can kind of guess where some of these men would vote, and that's because they have a voting record to tell us about it. And that's what makes the whole Liberty Republican such an interesting thing is that it's not based on their actions or their words so much before they ever got elected, like in their first run for office. It's because they have a strong voting record. So then that makes us ask the question, well, what is the guiding principle for a would-be Liberty Republican? That's somebody that sounds good and maybe they're saying the right things, but they don't have a voting record. And you might ask yourself, you might ask me, you might say, well, Liberty Dad, like, why does that matter? Right? Why does it matter whether or not they have a voting record? Well, let's look at Justin Amash's own words in a town hall. I think this was like from 2019. Okay, I could be wrong, but I think it's 2019. He gave this town hall and he's talking about uh how the parties basically swallow up members in Congress. Okay, so let's play this clip And I want you to hear the issue that we have, and it kind of describes why there's only 4 people that I can put up there and confidently say these are liberty Republicans. So let's take a look.
And we need to not have leadership just protecting each of the members, making sure that they don't take any risky votes or tough votes. Let's have votes out there. Just to show you how much people toe the party line. The typical member of Congress votes with his or her party about 95 to 99% of the time, which is astonishing. I got kicked off of the budget committee after my first term in Congress because I voted with my party only 95% of the time in the budget committee. They actually told me that wasn't enough. So that shows you how much they demand loyalty, and both parties do this. I currently vote with my party maybe about 70 to 75% of the time, which is a high percentage. I think most people would consider that a fairly high percentage. Yet in the world of Congress, that's considered like you're banished from our party. They don't want you there because you're voting with the party 70 to 75% of the time. And that's not a healthy system. That's not a healthy environment. That's not how it used to work. And I think we really need to address that. And it really comes down to our leadership, whether it's Republican leadership or Democratic leadership. They're doing the wrong thing consistently. They're demanding this kind of loyalty. And if you have a system like that, you're never going to get honest representation. You're going to continue to get the kind of representation we have right now in Congress, where most members of Congress just stick with their party consistently.
Okay. So as you heard from Justin Amash, both parties, the Republican and the Democratic Party, when you get into Congress, they demand loyalty, and like they literally kicked him off of a committee because he wasn't voting party line enough, right? Like this is what we're sending people in to face. So when we talk about a Liberty Republican, it does make sense to only call someone a Liberty Republican after they've been in office and after they've shown that, yes, they're willing to vote how they feel is proper, not necessarily with the party, even at the expense of getting kicked off of a committee. This is important for us because that is the defining quality. It's not what they say ahead of time, right? Because clearly a lot of people say a lot of things, they get into office in Congress and they get swallowed up because it's easier said than done. It's a lot easier to go in there and say that you're going to vote in a particular way, but then you actually have to deal with real people who can play real games, right? We're not sending somebody in it's not a committee. Congress is not this committee where people just sit around and say, what do you think, Bob? Well, I think we shouldn't vote for this because, if we do this, then this and this, and I think that's going to be a problem. And then everybody goes, you know what? That's a really good point, Bob. It turns out maybe we're not going to vote for it. And then some other people say, well, I'm a little skeptical of Bob's presentation there, so I'm going to go ahead and vote yes for it. And then everybody votes, and then wow, turns out either the vote wins or loses based on just a nice simple conversation. That's not how it works. Games are played. They will kick you off. They will drag your name in the mud. You might remember that Thomas Massie had his name dragged in the mud by President Trump when Trump was in office, right? And he stood firm. Thomas Massie also recently felt the wrath of, what's the organization? AIPAC. AIPAC came out and they basically, or maybe I think they might have actually said it, that he was anti-Semite because he wouldn't vote for more money to go to Israel. Right. Like this is the kind of thing that we're setting people up. We're asking people to go and do. If somebody's running for Congress specifically, we're asking them to go in and fight these battles. But we're also asking, and that's a tough ask. And so the thing is, they need to be prepared to stand on whatever principles that they have told us they will stand on. And not everyone does it. So few do it that we only have 4 Liberty Republicans, roughly. I mean, you might be able to find 1 or 2 others and say, hey, this person is not as big of a name, but they have some pretty good votes and stuff. But generally speaking, the same 4 names pop up. And I think that kind of tells us that we need to do better than just say, oh, Liberty Republican, not running a Libertarian against him. Because that might work if you're talking about these anomalies, these 4 people, right? But it doesn't tell us anything about every other office or anybody else that we might want to run against. And it doesn't guide us into telling how do we pick the right person for the role to run against a clearly non-liberty candidate, whether that's a Democrat or whether that's a Republican, right? Because there are some Republicans who would not be considered liberty Republicans whatsoever. Looking at you, most of Jacksonville City Council. So like we need to have a better principle, one that works all around. And this is where I'm coming from, right? What I look at it and I get accused of, oh, you're just towing the party line. Well, that's actually not true. Now, I am hyper partisan, but I'm hyper partisan for a reason. And that reason is one, I don't believe that we actually have a true multi party system. Now, technically, we do because you have multiple parties that can get in. But again, once you start trying to play in some serious leagues, you're going to run into obstacles. For instance, it's well known in the Libertarian Party that getting on stage or getting our presidential candidate on stage with the Republican and Democratic candidates is so tough that I'm not sure that it's ever actually happened. I don't think it's ever actually, if it has, it's had happened like once, but I don't think it's actually ever happened. We get shut out of the debates consistently. A lot of times we find that Republican or Democratic parties outside of Congress and other races, those parties will sue to kick us off of the ballot, right? And so we're not playing an easy game here. We're playing a very, very tough game. So where does that put us in certain terms of a principle? Why should it be meritocracy? So when it comes to a guiding principle, I say what we need, if we want to look at it in terms of getting the right person in the right role, then we need to simply say, are you as a candidate who wants to run for a particular position, are you of a caliber that's prepared to challenge who the other person is? That's the reason why I spun the table and I said, well, what if Ron Paul was running against Amash, right? Would you support him as a libertarian then? Like if Ron Paul said, I'm going to run as a libertarian against Justin Amash, who's running as a Republican, who would you vote for? And look, I love my people that are really big with Ron Paul. And some of them were like, no, I would totally quit. No, you wouldn't. Stop lying to yourself. You might grumble a little bit at first, but at the end of the day, if you're a really big Ron Paul fan, and the reason for that, for people that don't know, is that a lot of people credit Ron Paul for bringing them into the party, right? Like he was the person that they first heard about these ideas from, and it got them really excited. Right. So if you're that person, if you're a Ron Paul, what we call Ron Paul libertarian, basically somebody that came into libertarianism through Ron Paul, his actions and his words, if you're that person and you're super excited to this day about Ron Paul, if Ron Paul runs as a libertarian against any liberty Republican, you were voting for Ron Paul. I know it. You know it. So let's stop beating around the bush with all these, well, that doesn't make sense. You just don't want to play the game anymore. You don't want to play the hypothetical game. And the reason for it, the reason for saying that is to say, you know, that Liberty Republican in itself is not the end all be all, that there could potentially be somebody that you might prefer to support instead. So therefore, if we back that up and we say, Are you the caliber of person that can challenge this opponent or these opponents if it's a, like a three-way race? Are you that caliber? Then that guides us for Liberty Republicans, it guides us for the non-Liberty Republicans, and it guides us for everyone else. And it ensures that the party gets the best candidate in the role. Because I do believe that NOTA, none of the above, is an option. Meaning, if, let's say, there's a guy named Fred. Fred wants to run as a Libertarian for Senate against Justin Amash. Now, let's say Fred has never run for office before, ever, for any position whatsoever. He hasn't even run for his HOA. He's never run for a position. And let's say that Fred is actually maybe kind of new to the party. He's only been in the party for 8 months. That goes against Fred's caliber to say that you are ready to challenge Justin Amash. Now, that doesn't mean that Fred can't challenge maybe a local city council member, because that's going to again depend on who are you trying to challenge and how close are you to being an actual contender. Think of it in terms of boxing. I weigh 120 pounds, soaking wet, and I'm 5'3". Now, I want you to imagine that back in the days of Mike Tyson, I said, I'm going to challenge Mike Tyson to a fight. Everybody would rightfully laugh at me. They would say, DL, you are absolutely crazy. Mike Tyson is huge. He punches hard. He'll bite your ear. The odds are so stacked against you. It's laughable. Don't do it. But if I said, hey, there's a local boxing competition for amateurs, I think I'm going to get in on it. Well, most people would say, hey, maybe that's a good idea, right? Like most people would probably support that. They would say, hey, that sounds about at your level, right? Even if I hadn't been boxing for very long, they would support it potentially, and potentially meaning, some people might be like, hey, do you really want to get your face beat in? Yada, yada, yada. But for the most part, people would support it, right? Like they would support it much more if I went at that level. And then if I out of nowhere decided that I was going to fight Mike Tyson. Now, let's say I was a little bit bigger and I'd been boxing for about 4 years. I'm just making up stuff. I don't know anything about boxing. So if I get this analogy totally wrong, whatever, work with me. But imagine I've been boxing for about 4 years and I'm just smashing it. Like I'm just winning and winning and winning. I've had 1 or 2 losses. So it's not, it's kind of clear that I'm at least boxing within my range because I've had a few losses, but I'm just knocking it out. And maybe it's not Mike Tyson, but maybe it's, somebody that's a few levels down, but still too many levels up for just boring old 120-pound, 5'3" DL to go challenge. But maybe I'm a little bit bigger and a little bit more experienced. And I want to challenge, maybe somebody that's really good in the state of Florida, right? Well, people might be like, all right, well, it seems like you have been leveling up and you are at that skill level. So yeah, I think I could support that, right? And this is what I mean. We need to do it based on meritocracy, on what are you bringing to the table that shows that you are ready for that position. And that should be our guiding, and when I say guiding, the way that it works for people that are not in the know, some states for like in Georgia, they will at their annual convention, they will vote for literally the delegates will vote for who they want to run in a particular position. So if I lived in Georgia and I said, hey, I would like to run for Senate, then I would go up before the body, the Libertarian Party, at their annual convention, and I would give a speech and I would say, hey, I would like to run for Senate. Here's what I'm going to be doing. Here are my qualifications, so on and so forth. Somebody else may get up and say, I would like to run for Senate. And then the body could vote for who they want. Do they want DL or do they want the other person? In other states, It's not quite the same. So in Florida, I could decide to run for Senate if I wanted, and nobody could really stop me. The only requirement is that I am a registered libertarian, and that's a matter of the state. So the Libertarian Party, the best that they could do is maybe disavow me and say, hey, we don't know this joker, and whatever, he's a terrible guy, don't vote for him because he is a libertarian candidate, but he's not, he's not associated with the Libertarian Party. Like so based on state, there are differences on how this support could come about in the first place. And so when I say a guiding principle, whatever the role is, whatever the state rules are, the guiding principle should always be, whether you're voting as a delegate body or whether it's just people supporting a candidate, it should be based on, have you presented yourself as someone that's capable of running for this particular role. If I want to run for city council, the bar for me to show myself worthy is a little bit lower than the bar should be for showing myself worthy for asking for the presidential nomination for the party. They're entirely two different roles, and there's just a huge gap between them, right? Like, you have to appeal to people on a national level for the presidential nomination, but if you're on city council, then you're going to be focused more on the local people and local issues, right? So there's just, things are just going to be dramatically different, but the principle should be the same. So in my district, let's say let's use some scenarios here, right? Some real life scenarios. I'm not real life in terms of like actual people, but just not so much hypotheticals as they are just, you can find these exact examples somewhere. So let's just assume that I wanted to run for city council. And let's assume that there was only a Democrat in office. Okay. And if we look back in history for city council, let's just say that there's only ever been a Democrat in the particular seat that I want to run for. Well, I don't have to worry so much about my caliber as compared to a Republican. I need to worry about my caliber as compared to this particular Democrat. What am I bringing to the table that's going to challenge them, right? Are they somebody that has a lot of donors and somebody that has a large name, and are they somebody that has done a lot of great work, right? That's going to make it harder for me to challenge them. Not impossible, but harder. Now, maybe there's somebody that is kind of not very well liked, but nobody, like, you don't really see a lot of people running to challenge them, right? Or they manage to get in by the skin of their teeth, right? Like, they're the only Democrat, but they're not winning by a huge, they're not getting huge numbers of votes. They're getting basically enough votes to kind of say, yeah, you should be in the position, but nobody else really wants it. Nobody else is really challenging you, but you're clearly not winning by landslides here. Well, then then the threshold for somebody like me is a little bit lower, right? This is what I'm talking about. And the same thing applies. Again, we can use the same principle if the person in office is a Liberty Republican. Okay, well, they're a Liberty Republican at the city council level. DL, what is it that you're challenging them on? How is it that you're going to be better? And if I don't have good answers for those, then I'm certainly not prepared. So you see how this works? It works in the sense that if we evaluate a candidate, a potential candidate, based on their caliber for the given role, what are they bringing? Who are they challenging? What are they coming to the table with? Then, then I think that gives us an underlying principle to use no matter who it is and no matter what seat it is. So it doesn't matter whether it's city council, Senate, House of Representatives, at the congressional level, or president or governor. It doesn't matter. We need to identify, like, are you the right person for the right to challenge this other person? Are you somebody who's Ron Paul that people probably have a little bit more confidence in? And I say this with no disrespect to Justin Amash. I'm literally just trying to use it as an example. I think he's a great guy. But are you somebody who is Ron Paul and might be a tougher libertarian candidate? I'm sorry, Liberty Republican, or a tougher candidate on the liberty front than somebody like Amash, right? And if you are, then maybe then maybe we can support you running against this particular person in this position. But if you're somebody like DL, who's never run for office anywhere, then maybe, well, no, political office. I've run for some boards and stuff. But if you've never run for political office, then maybe DL, you don't have you don't have what's necessary to challenge somebody like Justin Amash. So you shouldn't run against him, DL. Go find somebody else that's more at your level. Because why do we want to spend the resources for you to fight a battle that you're clearly going to lose? Why do, going back to my boxing analogy, why would somebody want to invest a bunch of money in my training to go and challenge Mike Tyson if I've never fought in a boxing ring before and I'm a scrawny little guy, right? Like, why would somebody want to do that? It's almost like go pick on someone your own size, but in reverse, right? Instead of telling the big bad bully, go pick on someone your own size, it's telling the little challenger, like, find somebody at your level to challenge. That is what I mean when I say, and this is what I said on Twitter. When Justin, there was a poll that someone said, if Justin Amash wins his Republican primary and faces a tight race in the general election, should a Libertarian candidate run against him? Here's what I said. I said, I like Justin Amash, even stood behind him in line for food back in Reno, trying to make it a little lighthearted. Still, as a political party, the LP should never not run a candidate on the basis of a solid liberty Republican. Now, I chose those words very carefully. Should never not run a candidate on the basis of a solid liberty Republican. Then I went on and said, selectivity of quality of candidate for a given run is always appropriate. NOTA may be best. In other words, if the Libertarian Party is trying to, they have some candidates that want to challenge Justin Amash, and they're going to, maybe they're a state, and I don't know about Michigan's rules, but maybe they're a state where the party chooses who gets to run. If that's the case, like Georgia, then the delegates might look and say, none of these people are of a caliber that are prepared to go against Justin Amash. Therefore, we are voting for none of you. And we would rather have no one run because none of you are prepared for this role. None of you are right for it. And so it produces the same result as the never run against a liberty Republican. Apologies while I clear my throat. Okay, I think I got that cleared up. It produces the same result as the never run a Libertarian candidate against the Liberty Republican, but it produces it for a better reason. It also leaves the door open in case there happens to be a candidate who might be prepared to run against a Justin Amash or anybody else for that matter. The other thing that I believe that this does, because remember, we listened to Justin Amash just a few moments ago, and he was describing how people get swallowed up in Congress because Congress, Democrats and Republicans, demand loyalty votes. And so it's not always a guarantee for a newcomer that they will go from Liberty Republican in based on what they're saying to Liberty Republican based on how they voted, because some people just get swallowed up. Clearly, Ron Paul, Justin Amash, and so on and so forth, those four gentlemen that we put up, they didn't get swallowed up like that, right? Rand Paul, Thomas Massey, Justin Amash, Ron Paul, like these guys, they didn't get swallowed up so easily. They managed to vote even when it made other people mad. They voted in particular ways. And so this, where was I going with that? I lost my train of thought. I apologize because I'm dealing with this throat issue and I'm trying, like, for some reason, it's just not cooperating today. I'm trying not to clear my throat too much on the microphone here because that's like nobody wants to hear that. Come on. So, okay. So going back to what I was saying, this works all around, but it especially works when we're talking about somebody who is a would-be Liberty Republican. Because as I showed earlier, we should only call someone a Liberty Republican after they've demonstrated their ability to stand firm in the face of all the congressional games or political games, depending if it's not a congressional position. You don't get to be called a Liberty Republican because you're saying the right things before you've ever gotten elected. We should never allow that, right? This is one of the reasons why I was so big against Blake Masters out in Arizona in 2022. And I said, okay, well, he's not been tested. I don't know if he's going to be the guy that says all the right things and then gets elected. If he were, he didn't, but then gets elected and goes on to not, to be swallowed up and be the guy that says, okay, well, I just had to vote party line because if I didn't vote this way here, then later they wouldn't have given me this, right? We want somebody that demonstrates that they are a Liberty Republican, not that they will be. We don't want to just go by their word. A lot of people give us a word and they stab us in the back in politics. Like that happens consistently. So you don't get to be called a Liberty Republican until you've demonstrated your ability to stand firm despite political games. And because there are so few, we need a better criteria for identifying our candidates so that we always get the best person in the role that they're running for, right? And I would rather have nobody run for an office than to have somebody who doesn't belong there, because they're going to take time and resources from people. They are potentially going to make the party look bad, right? We don't want that. You look worse as a party. We look worse as a party if we put the wrong person to run as a candidate and they look like a buffoon than if we didn't have anybody. And so it's very critical that we have this view. The other thing is, by having this view, we tell people that are thinking about running for office, this is what you need. You need to make yourself a caliber of person that we're willing to support. So we send that message before they even decide to run. We send it, we say, look, we may not support you, even if you're running as a libertarian, if you are not the right person for that role. And the right person for a role can vary depending on the role and who the other people that are running in the race are. If you're running for dog catcher, to make a slight joke, if you're running for dog catcher, chances are anybody can run, right? And think about this. I want you to think about this for a second, libertarians. This literally fits what we tell people in the free market. When we talk about like minimum wage, we say like, hey, the guy that sweeps the floor, important job, no disrespect to him, but it's a job that anybody can do, right? Like the CEO of a company could sweep a floor, but the man that's sweeping the floor cannot necessarily, maybe, but not necessarily be the CEO. We know this. This is why the CEO gets paid so much more money than the guy that sweeps the floor, because the guy that sweeps the floor is doing a job that is open to a lot more people. A lot more people can do that job. We need to have that same view when it comes to politics. Hey, you're running for dog catcher? Turns out there's a lot more libertarians that are qualified to run for dog catcher than there are to run for Senate. Than there are to run for Senate against somebody like Justin Amash. Okay? So, in terms of principle, since we like to call ourselves the party of principle, we should implement a principle that gives us the best candidate for any role, no matter what. And we don't get that by just taking people off the table and saying, that's a Liberty Republican, we don't run against him. Because then what you're doing is you're creating an exception. You don't have a principle that you're operating on there that works everywhere else. The same principle that would say maybe this candidate ought not run against a Justin Amash also might say this candidate might not be good even running for dog catcher. It's the same principle at play. And I think it gives us the best candidate, whether it's dog catcher or Senate or president. That is how we should identify who runs, because we are a party of limited means. We don't have people for every single office. We don't have, the people to support every single office that might that we, excuse me. We don't have people. We're not flourishing with people to go and support every single candidate. We are limited resources. We ought to treat the public office, people running for public office the same way that we would treat any other position on the free market, by merit. Are you qualified for this role? If you are not, we're not supporting you, whatever that looks like. I hope that I've made my case why that sometimes you might run a candidate even against a Liberty Republican. But again, in many cases, if the Liberty Republican is a strong Liberty Republican, my way produces the same result, but for better reasoning. And you can use the same reasoning for any other position. And we have seen internally what happens when somebody runs unopposed and doesn't belong in a particular role. They don't do well. We've watched it happen, right? And this principle would safeguard against those kind of things in public office, because we're basically saying, are you prepared? Like, the only time it really wouldn't work is if somebody's running unopposed. Like, if there's a libertarian running for an office and nobody else is opposing him, well, then yeah, any libertarian can run and who knows what you're going to get. But the moment that there's another challenger, regardless of who it is, we want to make sure that whoever it is we're running is qualified to run against that person. And if they're not, then we should be like, whoa, whoa, no, you don't belong in this position. I like you, but this is not the role for you. And we should rather have the seat go empty than run the wrong person. Produces the same result, better reasoning. And no, I'm not doing party over principle, actually, folks, because I'm not one of the people that says we should always run a libertarian, because we don't always have a libertarian, for starters. So we couldn't do that in the first place. And we already know that there are some libertarians we would rather not run for a position. Like everybody's, you can ask any libertarian, is there somebody that you think shouldn't run for office? And they got a name. Some of them have a lot of names, but they got a name. So we all know somebody that shouldn't be running for office for whatever reason. Like, hey, I think they're a better fit here, or hey, they're just a terrible person. Hey, they're not even a real libertarian. Whatever the case is, right? We all know somebody or many somebodies that shouldn't run for office. This helps protect from people that might run for office that don't belong, by saying like, hey, you're not the caliber we're looking for. Period. Now let me address one more thing. Are there times where maybe you put somebody in that's not quite the right caliber? That's a maybe. This is where you get into the exceptions, which I'll take a little bit of flack for saying, hey, I wanted to push away from these exceptions, but maybe we have, maybe we do have an exception here and there, right? I kind of dogged on it at the beginning of the show. We ran somebody for governor here in 2020. No, 2020. Was it 2020 or 2022? Can't remember. It was either 2020 or 2022. I'm drawing a blank. I think it was 2022. But we ran a candidate for governor. Now, I supported this candidate. He's a libertarian. And a lot of people were like, dude, why are you running against DeSantis? And he's not quite a Liberty Republican, like, at all. But a lot of people liked him because he made a swifter turn on COVID lockdowns than many of the other Republicans who also had supported lockdowns. He made a swifter turn. He wasn't necessarily better at it. He just turned more quickly. Well, at that time, we hadn't run anybody for years. And I said, we should probably run somebody, and somebody who's resilient enough to take all the arrows that's going to happen. And then hopefully the next year, we run somebody who is more qualified to run for governor and will have to suffer less mocking, right? Because at the same time, let's think of it this way. Let's say the party hasn't run anybody for years, and we want to run a challenger against the governor. And because maybe they're a strong libertarian. I'm sorry, they're a strong Republican, but they're not a liberty Republican, right? And so we might argue that you want to get out of the way all the mocking and laughing, and so you send somebody in to take all those arrows, and then kind of create this foundation of, yes, we run candidates for governor. So you can make that argument, and I did. But you could also argue back at me my own argument and say, yeah, but DL, even if we haven't run somebody in years, we should still be looking for somebody who's a quality person that can challenge whoever it is. Again, whether they're a liberty Republican or not a liberty Republican. In this particular case, DeSantis, and I would argue strongly, he is not a liberty Republican whatsoever, right? Or whether it's a Democrat, right? So I made that argument, and you can have that exception, but I can also see where my own argument would be used against me, and it would be proper. And I don't think I have a strong rebuttal for it. So I think even though we could make exceptions, it can be strongly argued that those exceptions aren't even good in the first place, and that we're better off following this model of looking for someone who is the best candidate for a particular role, like the right person for the right role. And I think that this foundation is a good principle. It can be applied anywhere. It can be applied with any candidates, any opposing candidates, and it can be applied no matter what the position is. And it can cover even exceptions and say we don't need exceptions because we have a good foundational principle to operate from. We are simply going to treat it like the free market, and we're not going to ask the janitor to go and try to convince the board that he should be the next CEO, right? We're not going to do that because we've developed people who are C-level, and they would be better off. They would be better candidates because they have the experience to do so. Or using my boxing analogy, DL, you don't belong challenging Mike Tyson. Even as a retired Mike Tyson, you don't belong challenging him. You can go and box at your local boxing match with all the amateurs, some of those guys who have never been in a ring before as well. That's more your level, DL. That's where you belong, right? I think this is the principle that we should operate on. And then we don't have to worry about, well, would you run somebody against Ron Paul? Because the question will always really be, is this person of a caliber to run against a Ron Paul? And the answer is like I don't know that anybody can think of a name who they would believe might be a better candidate for office than Ron Paul, at least in Congress. I mean, you might think differently if you were talking about like governor or something like that. But at least for Congress, I don't think anybody can think of a name, right? So the bar is very, very high already. And if somebody isn't even close enough to reach that bar, then they don't belong there. It's that simple. All right. Enough pontificating from me. That's my show for today. Hope you enjoyed it, and hope you found it informative and inspiring. I want you to be sure to catch me Monday through Friday, 7 a.m. For an informed discussion on politics and culture. And then again, Sundays at 7 p.m. with my co-host, Susan Hogarth, where we discuss LP happenings. We look across the vast tyranny of this country, and we bring the news to you of what the Libertarian Party is up to all around the United States at different local and state levels. make sure you are subscribed to my YouTube channel, or if you prefer, my Rumble channel. You can go to youtube.libertydad.com, or you can go to rumble.libertydad.com and let me know how I'm doing when you're there by leaving a comment. I do read them. I get some interesting ones sometimes. Lastly, remember, if you are a champion of liberty, your business is people and your product is liberty. I want you to have a great week. But for now, catch you next time because I'm